Herodotus Histories, Part 2. Picking up where we left off after the death of Croesus' son. Soon came the Lydians, bearing the dead corpse, with the slayer following after. He then came and stood before the body, and gave himself wholly into Croesus' power, holding out his hands and praying the king to slay him where he stood by the dead man. "Remember," he said, "my former mischance, and see how beside that I have undone him who purified me. Indeed, it is not fit that I should live." On hearing this, Croesus, though his own sorrow was so great, took pity on Adrastus, and said to him, "Friend, I have from you all that justice asks, since you deem yourself worthy of death. But it is not you that I hold the cause of this evil, save in so far as you are the unwilling doer of it. Rather it is the work of a god, the same who told me long ago what was to be." So Croesus buried his own son in such manner as was fitting. But Adrastus, son of Gordius, who is the son of Midas, this Adrastus, the slayer of his own brother and of the man who purified him, when the tomb was undisturbed by the presence of men, slew himself there by the sepulchre, seeing now clearly that he was the most ill-fated wretch of all men whom he knew. Croesus, after the loss of his son, sat in deep sorrow for 2 years. After this time, the destruction by Cyrus, son of Cambyses, of the sovereignty of Astyages, son of Cyaxares, and the growth of the power of the Persians, caused him to cease from his mourning, and he resolved, if he could, to forestall the increase of the Persian power before they grew to greatness. Having thus determined, he straightway made trial of the Greek and Libyan oracles, sending messengers separately to Delphi, to Abe in Phocia, and to Dodona, and while others again were dispatched to Amphiaraus and Trophonius, and others to Branchidae in the Milesian country. These are the Greek oracles to which Croesus sent for divination, and he bade others go to inquire of Ammon in Libya. His intent in sending was to test the knowledge of the oracles, so that, if they should be found to know the truth, he might send again, and ask if he should take in hand an expedition against the Persians. So, Croesus comes out of mourning because of the rise of Cyrus, also known as Cyrus the Great, the king of Persia. He reigned from about 600 to 530 BC, and during his reign, he conquered the Median Empire. So he was a Persian, but when he was born, the Medes, an adjoining kingdom, ruled the Persians. And he conquered the Median Empire, then he conquered the Lydian Empire and the Babylonian Empire, and he united all of them, pretty much the entire Middle East, in the Great Persian Empire, and this earned him the title King of Kings. And he is in the Bible. In fact, he's the only Gentile, that's non-Hebrew person, referred to in Scripture as God's anointed one, which is the word Christ in Greek, and Messiah from Hebrew Mashiach. And he's called that in Isaiah 45. He is actually the king who God chose to send the exiled Hebrews back to Jerusalem and to rebuild the temple. So hearing about this, Croesus decides to take action, but before he does, he sends messengers to all these different oracles, and he's testing the gods. And he wants to see who's going to give him the best answer. And one of the ones that he goes to, or he sends a messenger to, is Ammon in Libya. Now, this is actually an Egyptian temple, but Ammon was a Libyan deity, and the Oracle of Ammon was situated in the Siwa Oasis, about 500 kilometers west of Memphis, the capital of ancient Egypt. So this temple is actually in modern-day Egypt, but at this time it was considered part of Libya. The oasis there was also called Ammon. Now, the Egyptians identified the Libyan god with their own supreme deity, Amun, and they called the god of the oracle Amun of Siwa, the Lord of Good Counsel. And the pharaoh Amasis, who was an ally of Croesus, built the shrine there in the mid-500s BC. So he's got a plan to put all these different oracles to the test. He's going to find out which ones are giving good information, and that's the one that he's going to ask about what he should do about this Cyrus the Persian. And when he sent to make trial of these shrines, he gave the Lydians this charge. They were to keep count of the time from the day of their leaving Sardis, and on the 100th day inquire of the oracles what Croesus, king of Lydia, son of Alyattes, was then doing. Then they were to write down whatever were the oracular answers and bring them back to him. Now none relate what answer was given by the rest of the oracles. But at Delphi, no sooner had the Lydians entered the hall to inquire of the god and asked the question with which they were charged, than the Pythian priestess uttered the following hexameter verses. Grains of sand I reckon and measure the spaces of ocean. Hear when dumb men speak, and mark the speech of the silent. What is it now that I smell? 'Tis a tortoise mightily armored, sodden in vessel of bronze, with a lamb's flesh mingled together. Bronze thereunder is laid, and a mantle of bronze is upon it. Having written down this inspired utterance of the Pythian priestess, the Lydians went away back to Sardis. When the others as well, who had been sent to diverse places, came bringing their oracles, Croesus then unfolded and surveyed all the writings. Some of them in no wise satisfied him. But when he heard the Delphian message, he acknowledged it with worship and welcome, considering that Delphi was the only true place of divination, because it had discovered what he himself had done. For after sending his envoys to the oracles, he bethought him of a device which no conjecture could discover, and he carried it out on the appointed day. Namely, he cut up a tortoise and a lamb, and then himself boiled them in a cauldron of bronze covered with the lid of the same. So this was his ploy to figure out which of the oracles was going to give him good counsel. He came up with the most bizarre recipe ever for tortoise and lamb stew, and he gave all the different messengers ample time to get where they were going. 100 days. That's over 3 months. So all these different messengers got to all the different oracles. A lot of them were probably waiting, but he told them on the 100th day, that's the day you have to ask this. And on that day, he prepared this tortoise and lamb stew weirdness. And it records that the Pythian priestess, that is the Oracle of Delphi, she's the one that knew what he was doing. And so he said, all right, that's the one I'm going to listen to. Such then was the answer from Delphi delivered to Croesus. As to the reply which the Lydians received from the oracle of Amphiaraos when they had followed due custom of the temple, I cannot say what it was, for nothing is recorded of it, saving that Croesus held that from this oracle too he had obtained a true answer. So apparently whoever the god and oracle at Amphiaraos was, they were also savvy to his tortoise and lamb stew. After this he strove to win the favor of the Delphian god with great sacrifices. He offered up 3,000 beasts from each kind fit for sacrifice, and he burnt on a great pyre couches covered with gold and silver, golden goblets, and purple cloaks and tunics. By these means he hoped the better to win the aid of the god, to whom he also commanded that every Lydian should sacrifice what he could. When the sacrifice was over, he melted down a vast store of gold, and made of it ingots, of which the longer sides were of 6, and the shorter of 3 palms length, and the height was 1 palm. So giant bricks of gold here. These were 117 in number. 4 of them were of refined gold, each weighing 2 talents and a half. The rest were of gold with silver alloy, each of 2 talents weight. He bade also to be made a figure of a lion of refined gold weighing 10 talents. When the temple of Delphi was burnt, this lion fell from the ingots, which were the base whereon it stood. And now it lies in the treasury of the Corinthians, but weighs only 6 talents and a half. For the fire melted away 3.5 talents. So, if you remember how much a talent was, they right around 25, 26 kilograms, so almost 60 pounds. Imagine these things weighing hundreds of pounds of pure gold. You can see in the picture here an example of Lydian goldwork. This is a small little winged horse type figure, so you can imagine what this giant golden lion looked like before it got melted. When these offerings were fully made, Croesus sent them to Delphi, with other gifts besides, namely 2 very great bowls, one of gold and one of silver. The golden bowl stood to the right, the silver to the left, of the temple entrance. These 2 were removed about the time of the temple's burning, and now the golden bowl, which weighs 8 talents and a half, and 12 minae, lies in the treasury of the Clazomenians, and the silver bowl at the corner of the forecourt of the temple. This bowl holds 600 9-gallon measures, for the Delphians use it for a mixing bowl at the feast of the divine appearance. It is said by the Delphians to be the work of Herodotus of Samos, and I believe them, for it seems to me to be of no common workmanship. Moreover, Croesus sent 4 silver casks, which stand in the treasury of the Corinthians, and dedicated 2 sprinkling vessels, one of gold, one of silver. The golden vessel bears the inscription, given by the Lacedaemonians, who claim it as their offering. But they are wrong, for this too is Croesus' gift. The inscription was made by a certain Delphian, whose name I know but will not reveal, out of his desire to please the Lacedaemonians. The figure of a boy, through whose hand the water runs, is indeed a Lacedaemonian gift, but they did not give either of the sprinkling vessels. Along with these Croesus sent, besides many other offerings of no great mark, certain round basins of silver, and a golden female figure 3 cubits high, which the Delphians assert to be the statue of the woman who is Croesus' baker. Moreover, he dedicated his own wife's necklaces and girdles. So quite a lot of treasure there. It mentions here the bowl that holds 600 9-gallon measures that the Delphians used for a mixing bowl for the Feast of the Divine Appearance. That's referring to the Theophania, which was an annual feast at Delphi, a festival in the spring celebrating the return of Apollo, who was the sun god, from his winter quarters in Hyperborea, which doesn't refer to a specific land. There's several different options that have been offered, but Hyperborea just means the far northland beyond the north winds, which the north wind's name was Boreas. So Hyperborea is beyond the north winds. And some people place this to the north of Thrace, basically Eastern Europe. Others say it's as far north as Iceland or beyond. But it just means the extreme far north where the sun was believed to spend the winter when it was cold in the central part of the earth. Such were the gifts which he sent to Delphi. To Amphiaraus, having learned of his valor and his fate, he dedicated a shield made entirely of gold, and a spear all of solid gold, point and shaft alike. Both of these lay till my time at Thebes, in the Theban temple of Ismenian Apollo. So he's always interested in the catalogs of these treasures, and it's worth mentioning how sacred these temple precincts were and the treasures enclosed there, because even when all these different states were at war and you have people who are enemies of this state and enemies of Croesus, allies of Croesus, when they're fighting and they're going back and forth, these treasures they don't change hands. They're pretty much untouched because doesn't matter who dedicated them, they're dedicated to the god. So to mess with these treasures would be to really invite divine retribution or punishment, which makes you wonder about the Delphian that he mentions, whose name he knows but will not reveal, who made a little inscription on the gift, claiming that it was made by the Spartans. The Lydians who were to bring these gifts to the temple were charged by Croesus to inquire of the oracles, "Shall Croesus send an army against the Persians, and shall he take to himself any allied host?" When the Lydians came to the places whither they were sent, they made present of the offerings, and inquired of the oracles in these words: "Croesus, king of Lydia and other nations, seeing that he deems that here are the only true places of divination among men, endows you with such gifts as your wisdom merits. And now he would ask you if he should send an army against the Persians, and if he should take to himself any allied host." Such was their inquiry, and the judgment given to Croesus by each of the 2 oracles was the same, to wit, that if he should send an army against the Persians, he would destroy a great empire. And they counseled him to discover the mightiest of the Greeks and make them his friends. Once again, a typically cryptic response from the oracle. When the divine answers had been brought back and Croesus learned of them, he was greatly pleased with the oracles. So, being fully persuaded that he would destroy the kingdom of Cyrus, he sent once again to Pytho, and endowed the Delphians with 2 gold staters apiece, according to his knowledge of their number. The Delphians, in return, gave Croesus and all the Lydians the right of first consulting the oracle, freedom from all charges, the chief seats at festivals, and perpetual right of Delphian citizenship to whosoever should wish. So Croesus is mightily pleased with this. He's going out of his way to bribe or otherwise win the favor of the Delphians and the god of Delphi, who would be Apollo. So remember that the Delphians, the place Delphi or Pytho, and the people there associated with the temple inhabitants, those were all sacred to Apollo. That was his special place. So basically, if you can butter those people up, you win the god's favor. So he's going out of his way with all these treasures. He's using his great wealth to his advantage, and you can see why the Greeks got the idea that he was fantastically wealthy beyond belief with these gifts that he's lavishing on the Oracle at Delphi, trying to gain the favor of the god for his expedition against the Persians. Then Croesus, after his gifts to the Delphians, made a third inquiry of the oracle, for he would use it to the full, having received true answers from it. And the question which he asked in his inquest was whether his sovereignty should be of long duration. So he's really going overboard. He's making sure all his I's are dotted and his T's are crossed before he does any part of this operation. To this the Pythian priestess answered as follows. Lydian, beware of the day when a mule is lord of the Medians. Then with thy delicate feet by the stone-strewn channel of Hermus, flee for thy life, nor abide, nor blush for the name of craven. Craven just means coward. When he heard these verses, Croesus was well pleased with them above all, for he thought that a mule would never be king of the Medians in place of a man, and so that he and his posterity would never lose his empire. Then he sought very carefully to discover who were the mightiest of the Greeks, whom he should make his friends. He found by inquiry that the chief peoples were the Lacedaemonians among those of Doric, and the Athenians among those of Ionic stock. These races, Ionian and Dorian, were the foremost in ancient time, the first a Pelasgian and the second a Hellenic people. And pause right there. If you recall, there's several tribes of Hellenic people divided either by 3 or by 4 divisions, depending on who you're reading. The 3 main divisions are the Ionians, the Dorians, and the Aeolians. Sometimes Achaeans are also added to that. But he's talking here about the 2 primary ones at this time were the Ionians and the Dorians. The first is a Pelasgian and the second a Hellenic people. So the Hellenic people are actually, they themselves were invaders of Greece who settled it. The original people there that were there before the Hellenes got there were called Pelasgians, and they intermarried, and so they're going to be part of this Ionian tribe. The Pelasgian stock has never yet left its habitation. The Hellenic has wandered often and far. For in the days of King Deucalion it inhabited the land of Phthia. Then, in the time of Doris, son of Helen, the country called Histaion, under Ossa and Olympus. So you can see there, starting out in Thessaly and moving up north closer to Macedon. Driven by the Cadmeans from this Histaian country, it settled about Pindus in the parts called Macedonian, over here in the west. Thence again it migrated to Dryopia, and at last it came from Dryopia into Peloponnesus, where it took the name of Dorian. So Dryopia is right down there at the bottom of the main peninsula, and then right across the southernmost peninsula is the Peloponnesian Peninsula, that part down there by Achaia and Arcadia. So this would have been the migration route for the Lacedaemonians, or rather the Doric peoples, originating up by Thessaly and moving all the way around the mainland and finally across into the Peloponnesian Peninsula, where they settled Laconia and became the Lacedaemonians. What language the Pelasgians spoke, I cannot accurately say, but if one may judge by those that still remain of the Pelasgians, who dwell above the Tyrrheni in the city of Creston, who were once neighbors of the people now called Dorians, and at that time inhabited the country which is now called Thessalian, and of the Pelasgians who inhabited Plessia and Scylace on the Hellespont, who came to dwell among the Athenians, and by other towns too, which were once Pelasgian and afterwards took a different name. If, I say, one may judge by these, the Pelasgians spoke a language which was not Greek. If then all the Pelasgian stock so spoke, then the Attic nation, being of Pelasgian blood, must have changed its language too at the time when it became part of the Hellenes. For the people of Creston and Plessia have a language of their own in common, which is not the language of their neighbors, and it is plain that they still preserve the fashion of speech which they brought with them in their migration into the places where they dwell. So once again, the Pelasgians were... That's a name of uncertain origin which describes the indigenous inhabitants of Greece before the Hellenes migrated to or conquered the Peloponnesian Peninsula. And the history and ethnography of these pre-classical distributions of people are not very clear to modern scholars, but it does seem that of the 4 Greek ethno-linguistic groups I mentioned, the Dorians, Ionians, Aeolians, and Achaeans, the Ionians had the strongest ties of lineage and language to the original Pelasgians. So they would have intermarried, and the type of Greek that they spoke would have been a dialect that bore a lot of the marks of this original Pelasgian language. And the region he's talking about is sort of the central eastern part of the Greek mainland called Thessaly. Here's a picture you can see here, the plain of Thessaly, the region of the Pelasgians. But the Hellenic stock, as to me seems clear, hasn't ever used the same language since its beginning. Yet being, when separated from the Pelasgians, but few in number, they have grown from a small beginning to comprise a multitude of nations, chiefly because the Pelasgians and many other foreign peoples united themselves with them. Before that, as I think, the Pelasgic stock nowhere increased greatly in number, while it was a foreign speech. So the ancient Greeks put quite a good deal of emphasis on ethnic Greek identity with the Greek language, people who spoke Greek, and they regarded Greek as sort of a superior language and a sign of civilization. And our word barbarian actually comes from the word that they used to describe non-Greek speaking peoples. Now, of these two peoples, Croesus learned that the Attic was held in subjection and divided into factions by Pisistratus, son of Hippocrates, who at that time was sovereign over the Athenians. This Hippocrates was but a private man when a great marvel happened to him as he was at Olympia to see the games. When he had offered the sacrifice, the vessels, standing there full of meat and water, boiled without fire till they overflowed. Chilon the Lacedaemonian, who chanced to be there and saw this marvel, counseled Hippocrates not to take into his house a childbearing wife, if so might be. But if he had one already, then at least to send her away, and if he had a son, to disown him. Hippocrates refused to follow the counsel of Chilon, and presently there was born to him this Pisistratus aforesaid. In course of time there was a feud between the Athenians of the coast under Megacles, son of Alcmaeon, and the Athenians of the plain under Lycurgus, son of Aristoleides. Pisistratus then, having an eye to the sovereign power, raised up a third faction. He collected partisans and pretended to champion the hillmen, and this was his plan. Wounding himself and his mules, he drove his carriage into the marketplace with the tale that he had escaped from his enemies, who would have slain him, so he said, as he was driving into the country. So he besought the people that he might have a guard from them, and indeed he had won himself reputation in his command of the army against the Megarians, when he had taken Nicaea and performed other great exploits. Thus deceived, the Athenian people gave him a chosen guard of citizens, of whom Pisistratus made not spearmen but clubmen, for the retinue that followed him bore wooden clubs. These with Pisistratus rose and took the Acropolis, and Pisistratus ruled the Athenians, disturbing in no way the order of offices, nor changing the laws, but governing the city according to its established constitution, and ordering all things fairly and well. So this character, Pisistratus, was the tyrant of ancient Athens during most of the period between 561 and 527 BC, and his legacy lies primarily in his instituting the Panathenaic Games, historically assigned the date of 566 BC. So, a crafty man, he was a tyrant, an absolute ruler, but Herodotus is indicating that he wasn't a bad ruler. He didn't change the laws or change the constitution, but he governed fairly and well, but he just had to have all power to himself. And he achieved this by this little plan where he pretended that he got attacked on his way to the city and asked for a bodyguard. We call this a false flag attack. This kind of fake attack to achieve a political end is what's called a false flag attack. And he used this to get a bodyguard from the Athenians, and he got to choose his bodyguards from all the best citizens and best warriors, and they followed him and bore wooden clubs. And this was the force that he used to actually take over Athens. And he seized the Acropolis. That's the high part, the mountain right in the middle of Athens that's got the high city up there with the great temples. That would have been the government and religious center of ancient Athens. But after no long time, the faction of Megacles and Lycurgus made common cause and drove him out. Thus did Pisistratus first win Athens, and thus did he lose his sovereignty, which was not yet firmly rooted. Presently his enemies who had driven him out began once more to be at feud together. Megacles then, being buffeted about by faction, sent a message to Pisistratus, offering him his daughter to wife, and the sovereign power besides. This offer being accepted by Pisistratus, who agreed on these terms with Megacles, they devised a plan to bring Pisistratus back, which, to my mind, was so exceedingly foolish that it is strange, seeing that from old times the Hellenic have ever been distinguished from the foreign stock by its greater cleverness and its freedom from silly foolishness, that these men should devise such a plan to deceive Athenians, said to be the cunningest of the Greeks. There was in the Paeanian deme a woman called Phaia, 3 fingers short of 4 cubits in stature, and for the rest fair to look upon. That's about 6 feet tall, by the way. This woman they equipped in full armor, and put her in a chariot, giving her all such appurtenances as would make the seemliest show, and so drove into the city. Heralds ran before them, and when they came into the town made proclamation as they were charged, bidding the Athenians to give a hearty welcome to Pisistratus, whom Athena herself honored beyond all men, and was bringing back to her own citadel. So the heralds went about and spoke thus. Immediately it was reported in the demes that Athena was bringing Pisistratus back, and the townsfolk, persuaded that the woman was indeed the goddess, worshipped this human creature, and welcomed Pisistratus. So this is indeed quite a plan, which baffles Herodotus that it would have actually fooled the Athenians, who, as he so humbly claims, are distinguished from foreigners by their greater cleverness and freedom from silly foolishness. So this woman Phaia, she was from the Paeanian deme. A deme is like a township that's apart from the main city that is the heart of the ancient Greek city-state. There would have been little surrounding towns and villages, and these were called demes. So this beautiful, tall woman dressed up as Athena, and they claim that the goddess herself was bringing Pisistratus back to reclaim the city of Athena, or so they called ancient Athens. And oddly enough, this plan worked. Having won back his sovereignty in the manner which I have shown, Pisistratus married Megacles' daughter, according to his agreement with Megacles. But as he already had young sons, and the Agamemnon family was said to be under a curse, he had no wish that his newly wed wife should bear him children, and therefore had wrongful intercourse with her. At first the woman hid the matter. Presently she told her mother, whether being asked or not, I know not. And the mother told her husband. Megacles was very angry that Pisistratus should do him dishonor, and in his wrath he made up his quarrel with the other faction. Pisistratus, learning what was afoot, went by himself altogether away from the country, and came to Eretria, where he took counsel with his sons. The counsel of Hippias prevailing, that they should recover the sovereignty, they set to collecting gifts from all cities which owed them some requital. Many of these gave great sums, the Thebans more than any, and in course of time, not to make a long story, all was ready for their return, for they brought Argive mercenaries from Peloponnesus, and there came also of his own free will a man of Naxos called Lygdamus, who was most zealous in their cause, and brought them money and men. So, kind of a bizarre twist. The Megacles belonged to the Agamemnon family, and they were said to be under a curse because when Megacles was the ruler of Athens, there had been a coup in the year 636 BC, when rebels rose up to try and overthrow the government. And Megacles defeated them, and they ran and took refuge in the temple of Athena on the Acropolis of Athens. And in ancient times, just as later, if you took refuge in a temple, you were untouchable. That was holy ground. Well, Megacles killed them all anyway. And so it was said that he and his family were under a terrible curse from the goddess. So Pisistratus is worried about that when he married Megacles' daughter and decides not to have any children with her. And this ends up leading to, once again, the outbreak of hostilities. So after 10 years, they set out from Eretria and returned home. The first place in Attica which they took and held was Marathon, and while encamped there they were joined by their partisans from the city, and by others who flocked to them from the country demes, men who loved the rule of one more than freedom. These then assembled, but the Athenians in the city, who, while Pisistratus was collecting money and afterwards, when he had taken Marathon, made no account of it, did now, when they learned that he was marching from Marathon against Athens, set out to attack him. They came out with all their force to meet the returning exiles. Pisistratus's men, in their march from Marathon toward the city, encountered the enemy when they had reached the temple of Pellenian Athena, and encamped face to face with them. There, by the providence of heaven, Pisistratus met Amphilytus the Acarnanian, a diviner, who came to him and prophesied as followed in hexameter verses. Now hath the cast been thrown, and the net of the fisher is outspread. All in the moonlight clear shall the tunny fish come for the taking. So spoke Amphilytus, being inspired. Pisistratus understood him, and, saying that he received the prophecy, led his army against the enemy. The Athenians of the city had at this time gone to their breakfast, and after breakfast some betook themselves to dicing, and some to sleep. They were attacked by Pisistratus's men and put to flight. So they fled, and Pisistratus devised a very subtle plan to keep them scattered, and prevent their assembling again. He mounted his sons and bade them ride forward. They overtook the fugitives and spoke to them, as they were charged by Pisistratus, bidding them take heart, and depart each man to his home. This the Athenians did, and by this means Pisistratus gained Athens for the third time, where, that his sovereignty might be well rooted, he made himself a strong guard, and collected revenue both from Athens and from the district of the river Strymon, and took as hostages the sons of the Athenians who remained, and did not at once leave the city, and placed these in Naxos. He had conquered Naxos too, and given it in charge to Lygdamus. Moreover, he purified the island of Delos according to the bidding of the oracles, and this is how he did it. He removed all the dead that were buried in ground within sight of the temple, and carried them to another part of Delos. So Pisistratus was sovereign of Athens. And as for the Athenians, some had fallen in battle, and some, with the Alcmaeonids, were exiles from their native land. Croesus learned then that such at this time was the plight of the Athenians. The Lacedaemonians, as he had heard, had escaped from great calamities, and had by this time got the upper hand of the men of Tegea in their war. For in the kingship of Leon and Hegesicles at Sparta, the Lacedaemonians were victorious in their other wars, but against Tegea alone they met with no success. And not only so, but before this they were the worst governed of well nigh all the Greeks, having little intercourse among themselves or with strangers. Thus then they changed their laws for the better. Lycurgus, a notable Spartan, visited the Oracle at Delphi, and when he had entered the temple hall, straightway the priestess gave him this response. Dear to Zeus, thou hast come to my well-stored temple, Lycurgus. Dear to Zeus, and to all who dwell in the courts of Olympus. Art thou a man or a god? 'Tis a god I deem thee, Lycurgus. All this is going on, and Croesus is looking at the Greeks, trying to figure out who is the strongest among the Greeks, who best to ally himself with if he is going to move against the Persians. So Herodotus is here providing the context. Basically, all the Greeks are at war with themselves or with each other. So he's given the selection here. And now he's setting the story for the Lacedaemonians or the Spartans. So they were at war. They had been successful in all their wars except against Tegea. They hadn't been able to beat Tegea yet. And now he's going to give us a little bit of background on them. They had been the worst governed of all the Greeks. They had no trade or anything. And then they changed their laws for the better. And he's going to tell us a little bit about how that happened with Lycurgus, the great lawgiver. Some say that the priestess, moreover, declared to him the whole governance of Sparta, which is now established. But the Lacedaemonians themselves relate that it was from Crete that Lycurgus brought these changes, he being then guardian of Leobates, his nephew, king of Sparta. As soon as he became guardian, he changed all the laws of the country, and was careful that none should transgress his ordinances. And afterward it was Lycurgus who established all that related to war, the sworn companies, and the bands of 30, and the common meals, and besides these the ephors and the council of elders. So Lycurgus is the great lawgiver of Sparta. He's kind of mythologized, so it's hard to say, but he's probably lived around 800 to 730 BC. He's the semi-legendary lawgiver of Sparta, and he established the military-oriented reformation of Spartan society that Sparta was so well known for. All of his reforms promoted the three Spartan virtues: equality, martial prowess, and austerity. So what he's saying about him here is that some people say that the priestess at Delphi basically gave him the whole plan for how to reform Sparta, but the Spartans themselves say that he went to Crete, and while he was in Crete, he kind of developed these plans and brought them back and implemented them. And these would be well known, the very unique Spartan constitution, which we'll get more into in depth later on, but all the things about how they trained and how they were all divided into bands of men that ate together, bands of 30. They shared all their meals in common. They lived together in barracks, basically. Even the married men, they had to kind of sneak home to visit their wives. And they were governed by 2 kings and ephors and a council of elders and all this stuff. We will cover this more in depth later on. It was common knowledge at that time. But all this, according to the Spartans, all this came from Lycurgus's reforms. So they changed their bad laws for good ones, and when Lycurgus died, they built him a shrine, and now greatly revere him. Then, since their land was good and their men were many, very soon they began to flourish and prosper. Nor were they satisfied to remain at peace, but being assured that they were stronger than the Arcadians, they inquired of the Oracle at Delphi, with their minds set on the whole of Arcadia. The Pythian priestess gave them this reply: "Askest Arcadia from me? 'Tis a boon too great for the giving. Many Arcadians there are, stout heroes, eaters of acorns. These shall hinder thee sore. Yet 'tis not I that begrudge thee. Lands Tegean I'll give thee, to smite with feet in the dancing. Also the fertile plain with line I'll give thee to measure." So Arcadia is the central region of that southernmost part of Greece, the Peloponnesian Peninsula, and the Spartans had their eye set on it now, and looks like Tegea was going to be the only problem. When this was brought back to the ears of the Lacedaemonians, they let the rest of the Arcadians be, and marched against the men of Tegea, carrying fetters with them, for they trusted in the quibbling oracle and thought they would enslave the Tegeans. But they were worsted in the encounter, and those of them who were taken captive were made to till the Tegean plain, wearing the fetters which they themselves had brought, and measuring the land with a line. These fetters, in which they were bound, were still in my time kept safe at Tegea, where they were hung around the temple of Athena Alea. So the Spartans, as many others would do, misinterpreted the oracle, thought they were going to win, and they ended up getting beaten by the Tegeans and becoming their slaves. In the former war, then, the Lacedaemonians were unceasingly defeated in their contest with Tegea. But in the time of Croesus and the kingship of Anaxandrides and Ariston at Sparta, the Spartans had now gained the upper hand, and this is how it came about. Being always worsted by the Tegetae, they sent inquirers to Delphi and asked what god they should propitiate so as to gain the mastery over Tegea in war. The Pythian priestess declared that they must bring home the bones of Orestes, son of Agamemnon. Being unable to discover Orestes' tomb, they sent their messengers again to the god to ask the place where Orestes lay, and the priestess said in answer to their question, "There is a place, Tegea, in the level plain of Arcadia, where by stark stress driven twain winds are ever a-blowing. Shock makes answer to shock, and anguish is laid upon anguish. There in the nourishing earth Agamemnon's son lies buried. Bring him, and so thou slight be the lord of the land of thy foemen." Now this Orestes the priestess was referring to was the son of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, Agamemnon being, of course, the king who led the Greeks in the Trojan War. He was gone for 10 years. A lot of stuff happened back home while he was gone. So after the Trojan War, when Agamemnon came home, Clytemnestra, his wife, murdered him along with her lover Aegisthus. Now, Orestes had been living in exile, and according to the poet Pindar, he was there because his mother wished to kill him so that he would not inherit the throne. According to Pindar, she intended to have her sons by Aegisthus inherit, and because Orestes was the son of Agamemnon, who she despised and then murdered, she wanted to also kill Orestes. So he returned after 7 years and killed his mother and Aegisthus, and was subsequently driven mad. And he recovered his sanity eventually, but this was a theme, this was a topic for Greek drama, this saga of Orestes. So the Spartans, if they want to beat the Tegeans, they have to find Orestes' bones and bring them home. When the Lacedaemonians heard this too, they were no nearer finding what they sought, though they made search everywhere, till at last Lycus, one of the Spartans who are called benefactors, discovered it. These benefactors are the Spartan citizens who pass out of the rank of the knights, the 5 oldest in every year. For the year in which they pass out from the knights, they are sent on diverse errands by the Spartan state, and must use all dispatch. So, these guys are basically enjoying the Spartan retirement benefits that you get. You're out of the army, you successfully made it through the rigors of Spartan life, and you're an old veteran, and so they send you on all these errands for the state. They basically became diplomats for the Spartan government. Lycus, then, one of these men, by good luck and cleverness found the tomb at Tegea. At that time there was free intercourse with Tegea, so entering a smithy he watched the forging of iron, and marveled at the work which he saw. When the smith perceived that he was much astonished, he ceased from working, and said, Laconian, you wonder at the working of iron, but had you seen what I have seen, you would have indeed had somewhat to marvel at. For I was making me a well in this courtyard, when in my digging I chanced upon a coffin 7 cubits long. As I could not believe that there had ever been men taller than those of our time, I opened the coffin, and found within it the corpse as long as itself. I measured it, and buried it in the earth again. So the smith told what he had seen. Lycus marked what he said, and argued from the oracle that this must be Orestes, reasoning that the smith's 2 bellows which he saw were the winds, the anvil and the hammer, the shock and countershock, and the forged iron, the anguish laid upon anguish. What led him so to guess was that the discovery of iron has been to men's hurt. Thus he reasoned, and returning to Sparta, told all the matter to the Lacedaemonians. They made pretense of bringing a charge against him and banishing him. So he went to Tegea, where he told the smith of his misfortune, and tried to hire the courtyard from him. The smith would not consent, but at last Lycus overpersuaded him, and taking up his abode there, opened the tomb, and collected the bones, and went away with them to Sparta. Ever after this time the Lacedaemonians got much the better of the men of Tegea in all their battles, and they had already subdued the greater part of the Peloponnesus. So according to this account, 7 cubits, if Orestes had indeed been that tall, he would have been about 10.5 feet tall. Croesus then, being made aware of all this, sent messengers to Sparta with gifts, to ask alliance in words with which he charged them. They came and said, Croesus, king of Lydia and other nations, has sent us with this message. Lacedaemonians, the god has declared that I should make the Greek my friend. Now, therefore, as I learn that you are the leaders of Hellas, I do so invite you, as the oracles bid. I would fain be your friend and ally, without deceit or guile. Thus Croesus proposed by the mouth of his messengers, and the Lacedaemonians, who had already heard tale of the oracle given to Croesus, welcomed the coming of the Lydians, and swore to be his friends and allies. And indeed they were bound by certain benefits, which they had before received from the king. For the Lacedaemonians had sent to Sardis to buy gold, with intent to use it for the statue of Apollo, which now stands on Thornax in Laconia. And Croesus, when they would buy it, made a free gift of it to them. For this cause, and because he had chosen them as his friends before all the other Greeks, the Lacedaemonians accepted the alliance. So they declared themselves ready to serve him when he should require, and moreover they made a bowl of bronze, graven outside round the rim with figures, and large enough to hold 2,700 gallons, and brought it with the intent to make a gift of requital to Croesus. This bowl never came to Sardis, and for this 2 reasons are given. The Lacedaemonians say that when the bowl was near Samos on its way to Sardis, the Samians descended upon them in warships and carried it off. But the Samians themselves say that the Lacedaemonians who were bringing the bowl, being too late, and learning that Sardis and Croesus were taken, sold it in Samos to certain private men who set it up in the temple of Hera. And it may be that the sellers of the bowl, when they returned to Sparta, said that they had been robbed of it by the Samians. Such are the tales about the bowl. One of the reoccurring themes we'll see about the Lacedaemonians is that their stories don't always seem to line up. Croesus, mistaking the meaning of the oracle, invaded Cappadocia, thinking to destroy Cyrus and the Persian power. But while he was preparing to march against the Persians, a certain Lydian, who was already held to be a wise man, and from the advice which he now gave won great renown among the Lydians, thus counseled him. His name was Sundanus. O king, you are making ready to march against men who wear breeches of leather, and their other garments of the same, and whose fare is not what they desire, but what they have, for their land is stony. Further, they use no wine, but are water drinkers, nor have they figs to eat, nor aught else that is good. Now if you conquer them, of what will you deprive them, seeing that they have nothing? But if, on the other hand, you are conquered, then see how many good things you will lose. For once they have tasted of our blessings, they will cling so close to them that nothing will thrust them away. For myself, then, I thank the gods that they do not put in the hearts of the Persians to march against the Lydians. Thus spoke Sundanus, for the Persians, before they subdued the Lydians, had no luxury and no comforts. But he did not move Croesus. So before they became lords of the great Persian Empire, the actual Persian tribe, the Persian people themselves, they were mountain people and desert people. They were known to wear leather breeches and leather outer garments, basically little tunics and pants. So the flowing robes and rich kind of silky type apparel that you might think of with the Persians, that came later. At this time, they were still very, very tribal and rural. They had no luxuries. They didn't even drink wine, he's saying. They didn't have figs to eat or anything good. So these were hard people. These were mountain fighters. These are desert people. These are tough people. And this Lydian is concerned that we have all this wealth and we live in great luxury. And what happens when the Persians get a taste for our luxury? If we beat them, what do we get? We get their land. We break their power. What are we going to get from them? On the other hand, if we lose, they can take all our wealth. Now the Cappadocians are called by the Greeks Syrians, and these Syrians before the Persian rule were subjects of the Medes, and, at this time, of Cyrus. For the boundary of the Median and Lydian empires was the river Halys, which flows from the Armenian mountains first through Cilicia, and afterwards between the Matiani on the right and the Phrygians on the other hand. Then passing these and flowing still northwards, it separates the Cappadocian Syrians on the right from the Paphlagonians on the left. Thus the Halys River cuts off well nigh the whole of the lower part of Asia, from the Cyprian to the Euxine Sea. That would be the Black Sea. Remember, Euxine is the Greek name for the Black Sea. Here is the narrowest neck of all this land. The length of the journey across is 5 days for a man going unburdened. The reasons of Croesus' expedition against Cappadocia were these. He desired to gain territory in addition to his own share, and, these were the chief causes, he trusted the oracle, and wished to avenge Astyages on Cyrus. For Cyrus, son of Cambyses, had subdued Astyages and held him in subjection. Now Astyages, the king of Media, son of Cyaxares, was Croesus' brother-in-law, and this is how he came to be so. A tribe of wandering Scythians separated itself from the rest and escaped into Median territory. This was then ruled by Cyaxares, son of Phraortes, son of Diocles. Cyaxares was at first treated the Scythians kindly, as being suppliants for his mercy, and as he held them in high regard, he entrusted boys to their charge, to be taught their language and the craft of archery. As time went on, it chanced that the Scythians, who were wont to go hunting and ever to bring something back, once had taken nothing, and when they returned empty-handed, Cyaxares, being, as hereby appeared, prone to anger, treated them very roughly and despitefully. The Scythians, deeming themselves wronged by the usage they had from Cyaxares, plotted to take one of the boys who were their pupils and cut him in pieces, then dressing the flesh as they were wont to dress the animals which they killed, to bring and give to Cyaxares as if it were the spoils of the chase, and after that to make their way with all speed to Alyattes, son of Sediates at Sardis. All this they did. Cyaxares and the guests who feasted with him ate of the boy's flesh, and the Scythians, having done as they planned, fled to Alyattes for protection. So these Scythians were a nomadic, horse-riding people from the area north of Asia Minor in the Middle East. And it's actually a civilization that spans a long period of time and a couple of different iterations of tribal groups. It's kind of a vague designation what a Scythian is. It goes all the way up into early medieval times with the region of southern Ukraine and stuff like that. But they were basically one of the main groups of nomadic horse archers from the Pontic steppe. And so a couple of these guys come into Cyaxares' territory, which is the Median territory, and this whole thing happens. And apparently these guys don't mess around. He insulted them or treated them roughly, so they killed one of the Medes' boys, and served it to him for dinner, and then took off to Lydia and took refuge with Alyattes, who was Croesus' father. After this, seeing that Alyattes would not give up the Scythians to Cyaxares at his demand, there was a war between the Lydians and the Medes for 5 years. Each won many victories over the other, and once they fought a battle by night. They were still warring with equal success when it chanced, at an encounter which happened in the 6th year, that during the battle the day was suddenly turned to night. Thales of Miletus had foretold this loss of daylight to the Ionians, fixing it within the year in which the change did indeed happen. So when the Lydians and Medes saw the day turn to night, they ceased from fighting, and both were the more zealous to make peace. Those who reconciled them were Cyanesis the Cilician and Labynetus the Babylonian. They it was who brought it about that there should be a sworn agreement and an exchange of wedlock between them. They adjudged that Alyattes should give his daughter Aryanis to Astyages, son of Cyaxares, for without a strong bond agreements will not keep their strength. These nations make sworn compacts, as do the Greeks. Moreover, they cut the skin of their arms and lick each other's blood. All right, so during this war between the Lydians and the Medes, there was, sounds like, an eclipse. And this eclipse was predicted by Thales of Miletus, who told the Ionians. Now, Thales was a Greek mathematician, astronomer, and one of the great philosophers, a pre-Socratic philosopher. He's remembered as one of the 7 sages or wise men of Greece. And many, especially Aristotle, regarded him as the first philosopher in the Greek tradition. And he's otherwise historically recognized as the first individual in Western civilization known to have entertained and engaged in scientific philosophy. Aristotle regarded him as the founder of the Ionian school and reported Thales' hypotheses that the originating principle of nature and the substance of matter was a single material substance, what the philosophers call the prima materia, and that substance was water. That was Thales' theory. So he foretells this eclipse, or whatever it was, and when it does indeed happen, the two sides make peace, and Alyattes gives his daughter to Astyages. So Astyages became his son-in-law. This Astyages, then, was Cyrus's mother's father, and was by him subdued and held subject for the reason which I shall presently declare. Having this cause of quarrel with Cyrus, Croesus sent to ask the oracles if he should march against the Persians, and when a quibbling answer came, he thought it to be favorable to him, and so led his army to the Persian territory. When he came to the river Halys, he transported his army across it, by the bridges, as I hold, which then were there. But the general belief of the Greeks was that the army was carried across by Thales of Miletus. This is the story. As the bridges aforesaid did not then yet exist, Croesus knew not how his army should pass the river. Then Thales, being in the encampment, made the river, which flowed on the left hand, flow also on the right of the army in the following way. Starting from a point on the river higher up than the camp, he dug a deep semicircular trench, so that the stream, turned from its ancient course, should flow in the trench to the rear of the camp, and again passing it should issue into its former bed, so that as soon as the river was thus divided into two, both channels could be forded. Some even say that the ancient channel was altogether dried up. But I do not believe this. How then did they pass the river when they were returning? So basically, the story goes they were stuck there, and he just dug a trench, dug a canal around behind them, and rerouted the river behind them. So instead of them crossing the river, they made the river go around them. But Herodotus writes this off because they would have had to do the same thing on the way back. So it's more probable, as he thinks, that they just used bridges. Croesus then, passing over with his army, came to the part of Cappadocia called Pteria. It is the strongest part of this country and lies nearest to the city of Sinope on the Euxine Sea, where he encamped and laid waste the farms of the Syrians. And he took and enslaved the city of the Pterians, and took also all the places about it, and drove the Syrians from their homes, though they had done him no harm. Cyrus, mustering his army and gathering to him all those who dwell upon his way, went to meet Croesus. But before beginning his march, he sent heralds to the Ionians to try to draw them away from Croesus. The Ionians would not be persuaded, but when Cyrus had come and encamped face to face with Croesus, the armies made trial of each other's strength with might and main in the Pterian country. The battle was stubborn, many on both sides fell, and when they were parted at nightfall, neither had the advantage. With such fortune did the two armies contend. So Croesus the Lydian has a number of Ionian Greek allies marching with him. Those are the guys that would have lived on the coast of Asia Minor, right bordering on the Lydian kingdom. So Cyrus's idea is, well, these guys probably aren't loyal to Croesus, so we can talk them out of it. But he tries to draw them away, but they're staying with Croesus, so they have this deadlock battle. Croesus was not content with the number of his force, for his army which had fought was by far smaller than that of Cyrus. Therefore, seeing that on the day after the battle Cyrus essayed no second attack, he marched away to Sardis, intending to invite help from the Egyptians, in fulfillment of their pledge. For before making an alliance with the Lacedaemonians, he had made one also with Amasis, king of Egypt, and to send from the Babylonians also. For with these two he had made an alliance, Labynetus being at this time their sovereign, and to summon the Lacedaemonians to join him at a fixed time. It was in his mind to muster all these forces and assemble his own army, then to wait till the winter was over and march against the Persians at the beginning of spring. With such intent, as soon as he returned to Sardis, he sent heralds to all his allies, summoning them to assemble at Sardis in 5 months' time. And as for the soldiers whom he had with him, who had fought with the Persians, all of them who were not of his nation he disbanded, never thinking that after so equal an issue of the contest, Cyrus would march against Sardis. So they're deadlocked in this battle, and Croesus decides, all right, this is no good. I need to get a really serious army. So he marches home and sends out messengers to all his different allies, Egypt, in Greece, in Babylon. He's assembling them all at Sardis in 5 months' time to start his campaign. Thus Croesus reasoned. Meantime it chanced that snakes began to swarm in the outer part of the city, and when they appeared the horses would ever leave their accustomed pasture and devour them. When Croesus saw this, he thought it to be a portent, and so it was. Forthwith he sent to the abodes of the Telmessian interpreters to inquire concerning it. But though his messenger came and learned from the Telmessians what the portent should signify, they could never bring back word to Croesus, for he was a prisoner before they could make their voyage back to Sardis. Howbeit this was the judgment of the Telmessians, that Croesus must expect a foreign army to attack his country, and that when it came it would subdue the dwellers in the land. For the snake, they said, was the child of the earth, but the horse was a foe and a foreigner. Such was the answer which the Telmessians gave Croesus, knowing as yet nothing of the fate of Sardis and the king himself. But when they gave it, Croesus was already taken. When Croesus marched away after the battle in the Pterian country, Cyrus, learning that Croesus had gone with intent to disband his army, took counsel and perceived thereby that it was his business to march with all speed against Sardis, before the power of the Lydians could again be assembled. So he resolved, and so he did speedily. He marched his army into Lydia, and so himself came to bring the news of it to Croesus. All had turned out contrariwise to Croesus's expectation, and he was in a great quandary. Nevertheless, he led out the Lydians to battle. Now at this time there was no nation in Asia more valiant and warlike than the Lydian. It was their custom to fight on horseback, carrying long spears, and they were skilled in the management of horses. So against everyone's judgment and to everyone's surprise, Cyrus, having been unable to get an advantage over Croesus, decides, I'm going to seize the advantage now that Croesus has disbanded his army, and so he attacks him, a surprise attack, a surprise invasion of Lydia. So the armies met in the plain, wide and bare, which is before the city of Sardis. The Hylas and other rivers flow across it and rush violently together into the greatest of them, which is called Hermus. This flows from the mountain sacred to Mother Dindymene, and issues into the sea near the city of Phocea. Here when Cyrus saw the Lydians arraying their battle, he was afraid of their horse, and therefore did as I will show by the counsel of one Harpagus, a Mede. Assembling all the camels that followed his army bearing food and baggage, he took off their burdens, and set men upon them equipped like cavalrymen. Having so equipped them, he ordered them to advance before his army against Croesus' horse. He charged the infantry to follow the camels, and set all his horse behind the infantry. When they were all arrayed, he commanded them to kill all the other Lydians who came in their way, and spare none, but not to kill Croesus himself, even if he should defend himself against capture. Such was his command. The reason of his posting the camels to face the cavalry was this: horses fear camels, and can endure neither the sight nor smell of them. This, then, was the intent of his device, that Croesus' cavalry, on which the Lydian relied for the winning of some glory, might be of no use. So when battle was joined, as soon as the horses smelt and saw the camels, they turned to flight, and all Croesus' hope was lost. Nevertheless, the Lydians were no cowards. When they saw what was happening, they leapt from their horses and fought the Persians on foot. Many of both armies fell. At length the Lydians were routed, and driven within their city wall, where they were besieged by the Persians. So then they were beleaguered. But Croesus, supposing that the siege would last a long time, sent messengers again from the city to his allies, whereas his former envoys had been sent to summon them to muster at Sardis in 5 months' time. These were to announce that Croesus was besieged and to entreat help with all speed. So he's trying to step up the allies, hit the gas, tell them to get there as quick as possible. So he sent to the Lacedaemonians as well as the rest of the allies. Now at this very time the Spartans themselves had a feud on hand with the Argives, in respect of the country called Thyrea, for this was a part of the Argive territory which the Lacedaemonians had cut off and occupied. All the lands toward the west, as far as Malea, belonged then to the Argives, and not the mainland only, but the island of Cythera and the other islands. The Argives came out to save their territory from being cut off. Then, after debate, the two armies agreed that 300 of each side should fight, and whichever party won should possess the land. The rest of each army was to go away to his own country and not be present at the battle, for it was feared that if the armies remained on the field, the men of either party would render help to their comrades if they saw them losing. Having thus agreed, the armies drew off, and picked men on each side were left and fought. Neither could gain advantage in the battle. At last, of 600 there were only left 3, Alcinor and Chromios of the Argives, Othryades of the Lacedaemonians. These 3 were left alive at nightfall. Then the 2 Argives, deeming themselves victors, ran to Argos. But Othryades, the Lacedaemonian, spoiled the Argive dead, and bore the armor to his own army's camp and remained in his place. On the next day both armies came to learn the issue. For a while both claimed the victory, the Argives pleading that more of their men had survived, the Lacedaemonians showing that the Argives had fled, while their man had stood his ground and despoiled the enemy dead. At last the dispute so ended that they joined battle and fought. Many on both sides fell, but the Lacedaemonians had the victory. Ever after this the Argives, who before had worn their hair long by fixed custom, shaved their heads and made a law, with a curse added thereto, that no Argive should grow his hair, and no Argive woman should wear gold, till they should recover Thyrea. And the Lacedaemonians made a contrary law, that ever after they should wear their hair long, for till now they had not so worn it. Othryades, the one survivor of the 300, was ashamed, it was said, to return to Sparta after all the men of his company had been slain, and killed himself on the spot at Thyrea. So it seemed like a wise solution to a problem, rather than having the armies all slaughter each other, just select the 300 champions and have them fight. Even that didn't work out quite the way they planned, because old Othryades was crafty and he decided to despoil the corpses. That's when they basically scavenge the armor and stuff and take all the trophies and treasure that he pillages off the dead bodies back to his camp. So the Lacedaemonians, they claim that they won. They're like, our guy stayed on the battlefield and you guys ran away and he spoiled your dead. So after this, the Lacedaemonians, because of the Argives, always wore their hair long. And this is something they were known for and noted for in battle. They would dress their hair before battle, and they always wore very long hair. All this had befallen the Spartans when the Sardian herald came to entreat their help for Croesus, now besieged. Yet for all that, when they heard the herald, they prepared to send help. But when they were already equipped and their ships ready, there came a second messenger, which told that the fortress of the Lydians was taken, and Croesus held a prisoner. Then indeed, though greatly grieved, they ceased from their enterprise. Now this is how Sardis was taken. When Croesus had been besieged for 14 days, Cyrus sent horsemen about in his army to promise rewards to him who should first mount the wall. After this the army made an assault, but with no success. Then, all the rest being at a stand, a certain Mardian, called Herodotus, essayed to mount by a part of the citadel where no guard had been set. For here the height on which the citadel stood was sheer and hardly to be assaulted, and none feared that it could be taken by an attack made here. This was the only place where Meles, the former king of Sardis, had not carried the lion which his concubine had borne him, the Telmessians having declared that if this lion were carried round the wall, Sardis could never be taken. Meles then carried the lion round the rest of the wall of the Acropolis where it could be assaulted, but neglected this place, because the height was sheer and defied attack. It is on the side of the city which faces towards Tmolus. So then it chanced that on the day before, this Mardian, Herodotus, had seen one of the Lydians descend by this part of the citadel after a helmet that had fallen down, and fetch it. He took note of this and considered it, and now he himself climbed up, and other Persians after him. Many ascended, and thus was Sardis taken, and all the city like to be sacked. So the fall of Sardis, because they had one neglected area of defense. Herodotus relates a very peculiar story here about King Meles, about how his concubine bore him, instead of a human son, a lion. And the Telmessians said that if he carried that lion around the walls of Sardis would not fall. But as is often the case with these types of stories, there's one place that looks super hard to take, so he just decides, I'm not going to do that part. And so that one part that's neglected becomes the weakness. Very much like the story of Achilles, when his mother supposedly dipped him in the river Styx, but she held on to his heel while she dipped him, so his whole body was impervious to the cut of steel, except for his heel. So the guy who finds the spot and makes the assault is a Mardian. That would be one of the Amardi tribe, which was a mountain people from the region of the Caspian Sea in the northern part of modern Iran. So he climbs up and leads the way. Once he gets inside, the other Persians follow him, and the city is taken, and Sardis is destroyed.